Hi, I'm Janice Switlo, and today I'm going to discuss the transition periods that have happened and are happening, and specifically addressing how Indigenous nationals refer to themselves and explain, who they are, where they're from. It's very critical to be very clear on how that's done. So, for example, previously people would limit themselves to saying, "Oh, I'm a member of such and such Indian band." And then sometimes that changed to, we call it now the, so-and-so First Nation Indian band. Most people don't realize that until such time as the First Nation, it becomes an incorporated entity under federal legislation, for example, through any of the opt-in legislative opportunities, if you will, as they're sold, that their band name is still technically has Indian band at the end. But anyhow, I digress. The point is that people would constrain themselves within the borders of these communities, these reserves and these bands, and identify themselves that way. Movement then grew to say, well, wait a minute, we're beyond that. We actually have a treaty. So today you have people saying, I've heard, I'm Treaty 6 or I'm Treaty 4. And a little better is, I'm from Treaty 6, for example, or I'm from Treaty 4, because, that would be like me, when I was living in the States saying, I'm NAFTA, or I'm a, whatever it was, TD visa. That justified my ability to be there. That doesn't define who I am. That's not Janice Switlo. That doesn't tell you anything about me, where I'm from. It just says that I am exercising an opportunity under a treaty. So I'm encouraging that people stop confining themselves and move into the next stage of liberation, if you will, that while you are from communities, in those communities are in areas where the Crown has been granted permissions under treaty, the fact is that the nationals are from a nation that has a number of treaties in place with the Crown. So an individual, a Nehio national, for example, is from a nation that can, has a large number of treaties, 4, 6, 7, no, sorry, not 7, that would be different. But anyhow, my point is that those boundaries are not the boundaries of Indigenous nationals. The boundaries for Indigenous nationals reflect their core linguistic background. That's your country. In terms of how Canada came to be able to begin to exercise some governance, self-governance delegated only by the Crown for her subjects, for instance, it was necessary to get those permissions. Otherwise, the other way to do it is, of course, engage in war, conquer, things like that. But because the Crown had come here, her subjects had come here and initiated more of a commercial relationship, trading, for instance, and felt that was an important relationship, and allies in different wars and things of that nature. And furthermore, didn't want to endure the possible costs and possibility of losing by engaging in a war. So the decision was made, no, I'm going to do a treaty with these nations. But here's the problem. There was no corresponding one king or queen who could speak for and sign off on behalf of all the Indigenous nationals, because the governance structure for Indigenous nations is very flat. It's very decentralized. Certain core issues will bring community responsibilities together to act together, but in general life, most local matters became contained within the communities. And it's just like any other society. You have different levels of law. So it's critical to appreciate then, so how is the Queen going to get something that she could feel, or he could feel at the time, the Crown could feel confident that those permissions are solid? Well, decided to just start moving across the country and getting and sitting down with Indigenous nations as the Queen's representatives, the Crown's representatives moved across. And so you have different nations referenced in different treaties. It's important to understand that the signatures at the bottom of those treaties, people talk today as if there were quote unquote First Nations and Indian bands under the Indian Act back at the time when treaty was done. Well, obviously that was not the case. You know, it's not appropriate to use those kind of references. The fact is, Indigenous nations then, Indigenous nations now. The difference that Her Majesty's Canadian governments have unlawfully and unconstitutionally interfered in the continuing jurisdiction of the Indigenous nations. But the fact is that today an Indigenous national should not, with greatest respect, be saying, I'm Treaty 6. In fact, you know, elders never really spoke like that. If you meet a true elder, they would speak to you about who their family is, you know, how, you know, I'm from so-and-so, I was so-and-so, and you know, it's like many, if you look at the Jewish example, right? Young men in particular have to recite their family lines so they know who they are. And at a certain age 14 I think it is. So it's important to know that when introducing yourselves, when writing a paper and describing who you are, start at the top. Those boundaries, those treaty boundaries are not your boundaries. Those are boundaries for the Crown. Don't make them your boundaries. The reserves are, yes, pockets of retained whole jurisdiction and set aside for certain communities within the nations, but that's not all there is. So I encourage people to branch out into the nation proper. Looking at those lines, look to the linguistic cores. The languages across, for instance, Treaties 1 almost to 11 and almost to the East Coast share a core language for the most part, Algonquin. And so that's why Nihio and Anishinaabe are related. And so the continuing relations, and it makes it difficult at times because, you know, you have this problem of power being centered in chief and council. We're seeing people start to understand how that's breaking apart, and where do you go from there? Well, first, clearly identify who you are. And it's also not possible to just throw away what's there. There's going to be a careful process of transition. It's not possible to go back to the way things were before interferences. It's going to be important to transition out of those interferences. But here's the key. Transitioning should not take the form of you abandoning your nationhood and you then coming under Canada as domestic ethnic minority. And that's all I have to say.